So, today, in the next couple of weeks, let me back up. We're starting a conversation at the Commonplace over the course of November to lead up to I'm calling it a family meeting on November 24th. November is a good kind of a family meeting, all right? Maybe some of your families, when Dad called a family meeting, you're like, uh-oh. But we want to discuss at that meeting, one of the things we realize we need to explain clearly and to talk about together is this idea of church planting. We've talked about this for a long time. It's time to explain what we mean by that, because I think a lot of us have different ideas. Some of us have no idea what that means. We've recognized for a long time that we have filled the coffee shop, right? And that for the church to go anywhere in the future will require a change of some sort. And so we want to talk about what we mean by church planting, what it would look like at the Commonplace, what it will cost us, what it will allow us to do. I like to think of it as if you were a gardener and you wanted to know if it was time to plant or if the soil was ready, you might take a soil sample. And so there's going to be a sense of what do we think Jesus is saying to us, and are we ready for that? Is that something God has for us in the future? Is it something He doesn't have for us? What's the timeline look like for something like this? So we want to explain what we mean. We want to test the soil to see, is now a good time? When would be a good time? And so that's coming up. We're only going to have one service that day, kind of like when we do celebration Sundays, but it's just going to be one service here at the coffee shop. We'll add lots of chairs, and then we're going to have a meal afterwards so we can fellowship and talk about what we heard. I realized that a decision of this magnitude that will kind of change the course of what our church looks like is not something that just emerges from a boardroom. I don't want to just have a board meeting and say, yep, that's what we're going to do. It has to be something that as a church we sense either yes or no or not right now. We have to have a burden for that. And so I really am hoping that Jesus gives us either a red light or a green light or a yellow light, like it's not quite time yet. So my sermons over the next couple of weeks are not going to be about the Great Commission or about how many people in our community don't know Jesus yet and how they need to hear the gospel. We all know these things, all right? And I think we all recognize that lost people matter to Jesus and He wants them found. The sermons for the next 2 weeks are going to be more about discernment and surrender. Okay, discernment and surrender. I feel a particular weight as a pastor in these moments not to create a false sense of excitement. I don't want to get us all excited about it and then recognize how difficult church planting is. All right, because the weight of planting a church cannot be carried on the shoulders of an emotional experience. So I was trying to decide and discern where should I go for these next couple of weeks, and then Tim Jackson is going to preach the third Sunday, and then we'll have this big family gathering. And so today we're going to look at the book of John, chapter 2, where Jesus turns water into wine. I don't think I've ever preached on this text. It's actually kind of a strange little story. But I think that in it, we get a picture of Jesus bringing fresh life to something that is kind of stale and old. And so maybe there's places in your own life that feel kind of boring or they've lost their meaning. Maybe even as a church, there are places that are just we just need some fresh life. And so that's what we're going to look at here today. So I'm going to work my way through the text here, beginning in verse 1. Starts off like this. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there, that's Mary. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Now, let's just kind of set the story here. Jesus has been baptized. He's 30 years old. He's beginning his ministry he's gone into the wilderness. He's come back from being tempted by the devil, but nobody really knows who he is yet. Except his mom. His mom knows who he is. And he's got a few disciples. There's a few people following him at this point. They're not even quite sure what to make of Jesus, but he's a very compelling teacher, and there's something different about him, so they've been following him. And so Jesus is going to a wedding. And in ancient Middle Eastern culture, to run out of wine at your wedding, and weddings back then would go like 7 days, was an embarrassment for the host, right? This was not like the fruit punch was a little empty. This would be like the caterer didn't bring enough food for everyone to have at your wedding. Imagine that if like you planned your wedding to perfection, you've invited all of these guests, the party is going, and then as they get to the last few tables, the caterer comes up to you as a bride or as the groom and says, "Hey, just so you know, I'm out of food. I've got some hot dogs in the van. I could grill those up." Like that would be a very uncomfortable situation. That's the thing you don't want to have happen at your wedding. And so this is a really embarrassing moment for the bride and for the groom in this culture, in this time. And for whatever reason, Mary knows about it. Commentators think, well, maybe she was involved in the wedding planning, but nobody really knows. We're just speculating. So Jesus' mother, Mary, comes to him and says, they have no wine. Fascinating. I don't know what made Mary tell Jesus this, because so far in the Gospels, he has done 0 public miracles. All right, now Mary herself knows that he was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and I'm sure growing up for the last 30 years with Jesus was a remarkable thing in itself. You know that he's not an ordinary guy. But we have no recorded miracles up to this point. For whatever reason, his mom comes to him and kind of taps him on the shoulder and says, "Hey, son, they're out of wine." And Jesus says to her, this sounds really harsh, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." I wouldn't talk to my mother that way. She's here today. Imagine if she came to me and said, "Hey, Josh, I was baking and I ran out of eggs. Do you have any I can borrow?" Woman, what's that got to do with me? So let me just kind of demystify a few things. Most commentators would say that there is no, when he calls his mom woman, he uses the same phrase at the end of John as he's hanging on the cross, dying for the sins of the world. He looks down and he sees his mom at the foot of the cross, and he says to her, "Woman," and he points to John and says, "Here's your son, and take care of my mom." And so some of your translations may actually translate it, "Dear woman." That's not in the Gospels. But the idea being that for him to call his mom woman was not an offensive thing in this culture. All right? However, they don't quite know what to do with the rest of it. All right? What does this have to do with me? The simple version is, that's really not my responsibility, Mom. And he would be right in that. Jesus is a guest. He's not in charge of the wine. He's just there to celebrate. And then he says, "My hour has not yet come." My hour has not yet come. That phrase, "my hour has not yet come," John uses that over and over again as he records Jesus in his Gospels. Often Jesus would say to his disciples, "My hour is coming," or "my hour has not yet come." In fact, at the very end, right before he's crucified, he's praying with his disciples in the upper room, and he says in John 17:1, "Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you." So this idea is that his ministry hasn't gone public yet. Certainly he has a couple of disciples. They're not even quite sure what to make of Jesus, but not certainly the greater Israelite nation does not know who Jesus is. It's not quite time yet. It hasn't come yet. And certainly his death and resurrection have not come either. One commentator says, Mary did not know what Jesus would do, but she knew he would do the right thing. Jesus, in this moment, begins to demonstrate that he is exceptional at turning ordinary events into extraordinary moments. He takes places of embarrassment and shame and transforms them into fresh life and new beginnings. What we're going to see in this story is that the embarrassment of the bridegroom becomes a place of great respect and privilege. So verse 5, I think this is my favorite passage. I just wish I could have witnessed this. Jesus says, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My time has not yet come." His mother just ignores him, looks at the servants and says, "Do whatever he tells you." Just do whatever he tells you. She doesn't argue with him. I think maybe she just knows she's Mary, right? And she's just going to do what Mary says. I don't know. I love that line from Mary. Just do whatever he tells you. We'll come back to that one later. So, verse 6. Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each one holding 20 or 30 gallons. Let me explain a little bit about these jars. Weddings would go on for a week, so you need to have ample water on hand for the ceremonial washing to make you religiously clean to eat the food. No family in ancient Middle Eastern times needed 180 gallons of water to wash their hands. That's a lot of water, just for a little hand washing ceremonially. They must have borrowed some from their neighbors. They've got these pots there. And the idea behind ceremonially washing your hands is this is not like a Purell station, like kind of antibacterial soap. They didn't know germs existed at this point in history. All right? We get the clearest picture of this in the book of Mark. I'll read this where you can turn there if you want. I don't think it's on the screen. Mark 7, verses 3 to 4 says that the Pharisees and all of the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly. Just saying happy birthday while you wash them. And holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. I would like to see how they washed the dining couches. This is one of these areas that has been added to the law, right? Now, there's nothing wrong with washing your hands before you eat. I think that's a pretty solid thing, you know? But this was about ceremony, not germs. All right, this is about thinking that washing your hands would make God like you more or make you more approved to God. It was a thing they had added to a religious nature, not just a sanitation issue here. This is about religious approval before God that God didn't actually tell them that they needed to do. I think, like many good things, this had been a good thing that had morphed into legalism and ceremony. So think through the places in your life that might be your ceremonial jars, okay? Even if you say, I'm not really religious, I bet we've all got things in our lives that are rituals or habits that maybe even have a superstitious quality to them. We do these things because we want things to go well. We don't, even though there's perhaps no direct correlation. Your football team is playing, so you wear your lucky t-shirt or socks or whatever, I don't know. Those places that are stale and empty. Maybe these are things in your life or even things in a church that at one time had a purpose to them and were meaningful but have since lost their meaning. They've kind of languished. These are the things that make you feel spiritual but really don't do anything to bring you closer to Jesus. All right? You fill in the blank in your own life. All right, so what's Jesus do? Verse 7. Jesus says to the servants, fill the jars with water. And they filled them to the brim. And he said to them, now draw out some of the water and take it to the master of the feast. The master of the feast was like the MC or the DJ at the party, the one who kind of gave the announcements and had a lot of responsibility to kind of keep the party rolling. So they took it, and the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, although the servants who had drawn the water knew. The master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone knows you serve the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then you serve the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. You're flipping the tables on me here. This is one of the first signs. The first of his signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. and manifested his glory. And then look at that last verse. And his disciples believed in him. Maybe I didn't have that verse up there, but it's in the Bible. Verse 11. And his disciples believed in him. Here's what stood out to me where I want to take this in relationship to our church. This is not a text about church planting. This is a text about Jesus taking something old and ceremonial and then repurposing it into something fresh and beautiful. And I love that Jesus takes the ceremonial jugs out of commission. Jesus could have multiplied the wine at the wedding in any number of ways. We read later that he has to feed a multitude of people, and he takes a few fish and a few loaves of bread, and he prays, and in some way they're multiplied among the people. He could have just turned everyone's cup of water into wine at their place setting. What I love here, though, is that Jesus repurposes the things and the places in our lives in a fresh and new way. Everything Jesus does in the Gospels is intentional. Jesus doesn't destroy the ceremonial jugs. He doesn't come in with a baseball bat and start smashing the pots and saying, "Why are you all washing your hands? This doesn't make you approve to God," right? Perhaps he even washed his own hands in them. What he does in this case is he fills the old and ceremonial with new wine. He gives it a fresh purpose. No one's going to wash their hands with wine, right? These jugs have now served an old purpose, and now they've got a new job. He takes the shell and he makes it useful again in a different and a more meaningful and a more beautiful way. Now, part of the Christian life is discerning this. In Mark chapter 2, Jesus is also giving an illustration about wine, and he says to his disciples, nobody puts new wine into an old wineskin because the wine, as it fermented, would expand, and if you had a wineskin that was already stretched, the new wine would blow it open, and you would lose all of your wine. Jesus says you've got to put new wine into new wineskins. One commentator says that sometimes the fresh move of God cannot be contained in old and expected forms. So when I think about that setting, I'm reminded of when we started our church 10 years ago. We just needed a fresh move of God, and it couldn't be contained in the way that we had done church for many, many years. Since the 1930s. We had church in a little brick building on South Fairview Street. But God had said, it's time for a fresh thing. And it's time for a new form and a new way of doing church. And that's why we now have church in a coffee shop. So sometimes as Christians, in our own lives and in church, we have to discern when is it time to just say goodbye to something so that something new can start. Other times, and the very next chapter in John, we read about Jesus going into the temple. And this time he does take his baseball bat with him. And this time he goes into a temple that had become corrupt. They were selling and extorting the people in the temple, saying that they couldn't bring their own sacrifices to the temple for worship. Instead, they had to buy special premium sacrifices, and they were really just price gouging people. Jesus goes into the temple, and he cleanses the temple, right? Sometimes the structures that we have are important and necessary, but Jesus needs to come in and clean them up, get rid of sin, to just kind of realign our perspective and help us to get back to the important things. And that's another important part of following Jesus, knowing when the thing we have is good and there's no changes, it just needs to be cleaned out. And then there are these times, like we read about today, where he comes in and he repurposes an old thing. He keeps the structure, but he just uses it in a whole fresh and new way. And that's another way in which we try to discern Jesus and our lives. Another thing that stood out to me in this text is that Jesus makes a lot of very good wine. The servants filled these jugs to the brim. And I just want to say that whatever Jesus does within the commonplace over the next year or two, I want to be filled to the brim. I don't want there to be any halfway filled jugs within the commonplace. I want there just to be a freshness and an overflowing. Maybe there are places in my own life that are stale, that have lost their purpose and meaning. I want him to fill me with new wine. And I love the fact that he creates so much of it. I mean, commentators would would agree that this is a lot. 180 gallons of water has been turned into wine. That's probably more than this party needs. And yet, this is so much like Jesus. Do you remember? I'll go back to the feeding of the 5,000. He multiplies the bread and the fish, so much so that they collected 12 basketfuls of leftovers. When Jesus does something, he doesn't do it with meagerness or poverty or, well, maybe we'll make it through. There's just this abundance to the life of Christ that's beautiful to me. And I just want that whatever it is that Jesus calls us to do, let's not have a poverty mentality. Let's not define our future by limitations. Let's not say, Jesus, I don't think we can do that thing that you're calling us to because we don't have the resources for it. Let's be like Mary here and make some audacious requests. The places that we see limitations, Jesus sees opportunity. Let's not sacrifice quality on the altar of efficiency. It was common in Middle Eastern times to cut the wine with water, make it stretch a little bit, especially as the party goes on and people have had a few glasses of wine, they would start to add water to it. Jesus doesn't dilute the wine to make it stretch. He just makes a lot of it. He redeems a very difficult situation. That's probably one of the most beautiful parts of the story here. If we go back to the groom and to the bride, who are aware that maybe there's not enough wine for all the people, and then suddenly, because Jesus is present, he turns their embarrassment into this place where people are now congratulating them on, boy, you saved the best for last. I've never heard of anybody doing it that way before. Where you know what, maybe there's some places in your own life that you're a little bit embarrassed. You say to yourself, if people only knew how I'm faking it, or how bad of a parent I am, or how I was screaming at the kids as we pulled into church today, and then I said, now, shut up, we're going to church, we're going to worship Jesus. I don't know what your story might have looked like, but I know that I'm a dad, all right? So I know that the journey of trying to put on a mask. You want to look good sometimes in a way that's not necessarily genuine. And there's just embarrassing places in our lives that we don't want people to see and know. Habits that we can't break. And what Jesus wants to do is he wants to come into those places and redeem them and transform them and make them beautiful again. And that's what Jesus does here. And as a result, it says his disciples believed in him. How crazy is that? That he had people, these men were following him as the Rabbi Jesus, but they didn't believe in him yet. And that's I think a beautiful picture of the church, that often in church there are people who are on a journey to Jesus and they're kind of curious about the ways of Jesus, and then as they begin to experience him in their lives, Jesus begins to create belief, and then they say, I am all in. You are the Messiah. You are the Son of God. Sometimes we journey on the Jesus path for a while before our hearts are fully on board. Which now takes us back to the big picture of salvation. Jesus, in the end, redeems humanity. If we go back and think about Mary here, we don't hear about Mary again. John never writes Mary into the script in his gospel until the very end. He kind of bookends his gospel with this encounter with Jesus and his mom at the beginning as he turns water into wine. And then at the end, whenever he is on the cross, and he has just told his disciples that when he is having the final dinner with them and he hands the cup to them, he says, this cup, it represents my blood. He redefines wine at the end and he says, I am the new covenant. And my blood is now enough to wash away your sin. On the cross, his hour had come. And because of the cross and because of Jesus, he has authority and power to move in the places of your life that feel stale, that feel boring, that feel insignificant, and that have lost their meaning. And he is able to repurpose those places if you will let him. And that's really what I want Jesus to do for the commonplace. I know that we need Jesus to do a new and a fresh thing here. And I don't know what it will look like exactly, but I do need you to pray with me, okay? I need us to believe, like the disciples, that he has authority and power. Mary's words to the servants should be ours as well. Do whatever he tells you to do. That's my prayer, that we would come to Jesus and we would say, Jesus, we are willing to do whatever you tell us to do. It might not make sense, but in the end, when we obey, new life happens. And perhaps for you today, there are some places in your life that you just need Jesus to breathe new life into. If you want someone to pray with you as our worship team comes and leads us, I am more than happy. Some of those broken places of our lives, to pray with you and to see what Jesus might do. So if you bow your heads with me as the worship team comes, I will lead us in prayer. I'm just going to be quiet for a minute. Let's just say, Holy Spirit, bring to mind the places that we might feel a little stale, that have kind of lost their meaning. Jesus, I'm aware that the commonplace is your church, and that it's your job that you will build your church. We don't want to rush ahead of you. We don't want to do things that you've not called us to do. We want to do them your way and in your time. And so we're asking that you would make that aware to us, make us aware of those plans. And I pray for anyone here. Some people have thoughts right now of places that are stale, haven't experienced the freshness that Jesus brings. Would you just do a miracle in those places? Help them to experience your power in a fresh and a new way. In Jesus' name, amen.
Please rise as we continue to worship together.